I never thought the sound of a slap could echo louder in my memory than any scream, but that night it did. My stepmother Diana's hand cut across my cheek so hard I felt the sting rush into my ear. I stumbled backward, shocked the room spinning as my sister Melissa's voice pierced the air like a dagger. She screamed that I had stolen her precious diamond necklace, the family heirloom that was supposed to be passed to her on her engagement. My face burned from the impact, but what burned even more was the way everyone's eyes turned on me as if I had been caught red-handed. I had not touched that necklace, not even looked at it twice yet. In that moment, my voice disappeared beneath the roar of accusations. "You thief, you liar, how dare you!" Diana spat her lips, trembling with rage as if she had waited years for a moment like this. "My father." Richard stood near the dining table, his jaw clenched, his face pale. He didn't raise a hand to stop Diana. He didn't even flinch when I cried out, "Dad, I didn't take it." Instead, he looked at me with eyes that carried both shame and suspicion, like I had dragged dirt into the house by existing. Melissa clutched her neck dramatically where the necklace had been minutes ago, sobbing and shaking as if her entire future had been stolen. She shouted that she saw me looking at it, that she had always known I was jealous that I had finally revealed my true colors. The guests who had gathered for dinner gasped, whispering among themselves, their glances slicing me open. Diana raised her hand again, and for a second I thought she would strike me once more, but instead she grabbed me by the arm so hard her nails dug into my skin. She dragged me toward the front door like I was nothing but trash to be taken out. My legs wobbled as I tried to resist, but her grip was iron. "Out of my house," she screamed, spit flying from her mouth, her voice so shrill that my ears rang. "You will not shame this family one more second. Get out before I call the police." I glanced at my father, begging with my eyes for him to say something to stop this, to remember I was his daughter too. But he only lowered his gaze to the floor and muttered, "If you're innocent, why is it always you at the center of trouble?" His words cracked something inside me more painfully than the slap. Melissa's sobs filled the hallway like thunder as Diana shoved me through the doorway, the cold night air slamming into my face. The snow outside glowed pale under the streetlight, flakes drifting down like silent witnesses. I stumbled onto the icy steps barefoot because she hadn't even let me grab my shoes. My cheek throbbed, my heart raced, my body shook with humiliation and terror. Behind me, the door slammed shut with a finality that felt like the end of a chapter, the end of belonging. I stood there shivering, my breath fogging the air, staring at the door that had always meant home. Now it meant exile. I shouted through the wood, "I didn't do it. I swear I didn't." But the only answer was Melissa's muffled sobs and Diana's voice calling me a disgrace. The neighbors' curtains twitched shadows moving behind the glass, as if the whole street was watching. I wrapped my arms around myself, hot tears freezing on my cheeks. I wanted to run back in to grab that necklace and shove it in their faces, to scream the truth until they had no choice but to listen. But I had nothing. No evidence, no ally, not even my father's protection. I was alone, thrown out into the night like a criminal for a crime I had not committed. The slap still echoed in my ears, not just the sound, but the weight behind it. The symbol of years of suspicion, years of being treated as less, years of being the outsider in my own home. In that single strike, Diana had not only branded me a thief, but also erased any place I thought I had in my family. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my head, each beat screaming that my life had just changed forever. I stumbled down the driveway, the icy gravel biting into my feet, glancing back once more at the glowing windows where laughter had once felt warm to me. Now those lights burned like fire, mocking me. I whispered into the night, "One day the truth will come out," but even as I said it, doubt poisoned me. What if it never did? What if I was forever the girl who had been slapped out of her own family's door, accused of stealing what she never touched? As the snow swallowed my footsteps, I realized the worst pain wasn't the sting on my cheek or the cold in my bones. It was the betrayal that cut deeper than any wound, the certainty that the people meant to protect me had turned me into their enemy. My name is Allison, and I am 27 years old, though most days I feel decades older because of what I have been through. To understand how I ended up standing barefoot in the snow outside my own house, you need to know the family I was born into and the one that later swallowed me whole. My biological mother died when I was 6. I remember her laugh soft and musical the way she would braid my hair before school, the smell of lavender soap that lingered on her clothes. When she passed away from a sudden illness, my father Richard remarried only 2 years later. He chose Diana, a nurse who on the surface looked kind and capable, the type of woman who could hold a family together. But once she moved into our modest Ohio home, it became clear that her warmth was reserved only for my father and her own daughter, Melissa. To me, she was strict cold and quick to anger. Melissa was my stepsister, but we were close in age, she being only 3 years older. In childhood, we played in the yard together, climbed trees, and even shared secrets at night when we were supposed to be sleeping. But as we grew older, the differences between us began to widen into a canyon. Melissa was always praised for her beauty, her charm, her way of commanding attention. Relatives would gush over her while I stood in the background, awkward, quiet, unsure how to shine. My father adored her, and Diana treated her like a queen. I, on the other hand, was constantly criticized for being too clumsy, too plain, too slow. When Melissa won school competitions, the whole house celebrated. When I came home with decent but not outstanding grades, my achievements were brushed aside with a shrug. My father was a high school math teacher, intelligent but tired, the kind of man who carried his weariness home with him. He loved to appear fair in front of others, but at home, his fairness crumbled into silence. When Diana scolded me when she raised her hand to slap my arm for forgetting chores, he would simply look away. "She needs discipline," Diana would say, and he would nod. That nod cut deeper than the slap. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had become the scapegoat of the family. Melissa accused me of borrowing her clothes without asking, of stealing her makeup, of breaking her hairdryer, and each time I denied it, Diana would frown and say, "You always make excuses, Allison. You have to own up to your mistakes." Melissa knew she could lie and get away with it. The more she lied, the more they believed her, and the more isolated I became. I took refuge in schoolwork and books, in long walks alone, anything to escape the suffocating walls of that house. After graduation, I enrolled in community college while Melissa won a scholarship to a university in the city. My father beamed with pride at her achievement, hosting a party to celebrate. For me, there was only a pat on the shoulder and a reminder that I should try harder. Still, I held on to hope. I believed that if I worked quietly and showed respect, they would eventually see me for who I was. When Melissa returned from college, she always seemed brighter, louder, more dazzling. She had stories of her friends in the city of parties and internships of professors who adored her. I listened politely while Diana and my father showered her with admiration. No one asked how my classes were going or how many hours I worked at the local cafe to pay for my books. The resentment grew in small increments, building like pressure behind a dam. Sometimes Diana would force me to hand over part of my paycheck for family expenses, even though Melissa never contributed a dime. Sometimes Melissa would mock me in front of her friends, calling me the poor little stepsister who still lived at home. And sometimes Richard would scold me for being ungrateful when I dared to protest. I began to feel invisible, erased, like my existence was nothing but an inconvenience. Still, I endured. I told myself family was supposed to be difficult but worth holding on to. I told myself loyalty and patience would eventually be rewarded. Yet the truth was simpler and crueler. Diana did not want me there. She wanted her perfect little family with her daughter and my father, and I was the reminder of the woman who came before her. Every look of disdain carried that message. Every punishment carried that message. And Melissa, sensing the power she held, wielded it like a weapon. She whispered lies that cut me down, and each time I tried to defend myself, Diana and Richard turned cold. By the time I was in my 20s, the dynamic was set in stone. I was the outsider in my own house, the one no one trusted, the one who would always be suspected first when anything went wrong. The slap that night was not the beginning of my downfall, but the inevitable result of years of erosion, years of being told I was less. When Melissa pointed at me and cried "thief," when Diana's palm struck my face, when my father's eyes looked away, it was not sudden. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being blamed. That is why the pain in that moment was not just physical. It was history repeating itself louder, harsher, final. Living under Diana's roof felt like walking across shards of glass barefoot, every step painful, every breath monitored. She had a way of making me feel as though I owed her my very existence, as if I was living in that house on borrowed time. Whenever I earned money from my job at the cafe, she would stand in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, and demand that I hand over a portion for the family fund. "If you want to live here, you contribute," she would say, her eyes daring me to argue. Melissa never paid anything, not a single cent yet. Diana never questioned her. Instead, Melissa would sit at the counter sipping coffee with a smirk, watching me hand over folded bills like a servant. The more I worked, the more they took, and still they called me ungrateful. Control was Diana's language, and fear was her punctuation. She dictated what I wore, frowning at shirts that she considered too casual or skirts she thought too short. "You'll embarrass us if you step out looking like that," she would say. If I made a friend she disapproved of, she would forbid me from seeing them, claiming they were a bad influence. Melissa, meanwhile, dated whoever she wanted, went to parties at all hours, and when she stumbled home smelling of alcohol, Diana would only laugh and call her spirited. The hypocrisy twisted inside me like a knife. My father, Richard, rarely intervened. He spent most evenings buried in school papers, grading with his glasses perched low on his nose. When Diana's voice rose when Melissa mocked me when I raised mine in protest, he would sigh and say, "Stop the fighting, Allison! Why do you always stir things up?" His passivity was worse than Diana's rage. It taught me that in this house, silence was safer than truth. Yet I was not blind to the danger brewing. I saw how Melissa studied me, how her eyes lit up when I made mistakes, how she whispered to Diana in corners. Once, she accused me of scratching her car with my keys. I had never touched it, but she produced a tiny scrape near the door handle and pointed at me as if I had carved it myself. Diana believed her, instantly scolded me until my ears rang, and ordered me to clean Melissa's car inside and out as punishment. I scrubbed for hours with tears blurring my vision, knowing Melissa was inside, laughing. Another time, Melissa claimed I had stolen $20 from her wallet. She marched into the living room, waving the empty billfold, declaring I was the only one who could have taken it. Diana demanded to search my room. They went through my drawers, my purse, even under my mattress, while I stood shaking with humiliation. They found nothing, of course, but the suspicion lingered. "Maybe she spent it already," Melissa said slyly, and Diana nodded as though it was truth. "My father didn't defend me. He only rubbed his temples and muttered, 'Why does this keep happening with you, Allison?'" Each false accusation tightened the noose around my reputation. Each silence from my father stripped away another piece of trust. I began to feel like a prisoner waiting for sentencing, my every move, watched my every word, doubted. Nights were the hardest. I would lie awake listening to the creaks of the old house, replaying the day's events in my mind, wondering how long before Melissa struck again, how long before Diana raised her hand. Sometimes I would stare at the ceiling and whisper to myself that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't the liar they made me out to be. But the more I whispered, the less sure I became. Control seeped into my bones. Even small decisions felt dangerous. If I wanted to buy a new pair of shoes, I hesitated, knowing Diana might scold me for wasting money. If I lingered too long outside after work, I feared Melissa would claim I had been meeting someone inappropriate. They shaped me into a shadow of myself, cautious, silent, afraid to exist too loudly. And yet, despite the fear, there was a stubborn ember inside me that refused to go out. I knew Melissa enjoyed pushing me, baiting me, weaving stories that painted me as a villain. I knew Diana's slap-happy discipline and her sharp tongue were weapons of power. And I knew my father's silence was a choice, not weakness. They all played their roles in the cage that surrounded me. Part of me suspected even then that one day the dam would burst, that Melissa's lies would reach too far, that Diana's control would crush too hard, that my father's silence would be exposed for the betrayal it was. I didn't know when or how, but I felt it coming like a storm you sense in the air before the clouds gather. The foreshadowing was everywhere, woven into the daily humiliations, into the constant comparisons, into the bruises hidden under long sleeves. I carried it all waiting, fearing, bracing for the moment when suspicion would turn into open war. That night began like so many others with tension simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest spark. It was a Saturday evening in December, the kind of night when families gathered for warmth and conversation. But in our household, warmth had always been conditional. Melissa had just returned from a shopping trip with Diana, showing off her new dress and a diamond necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, a family heirloom that Diana guarded like treasure. The necklace had recently been given to Melissa in preparation for her engagement, and Diana insisted everyone admire it. I sat at the edge of the table silent, watching Melissa preen as she placed the necklace around her neck, then took it off to wash her hands before dinner. She left it on the counter by the sink, the diamond catching the light like a star. I noticed it, yes, but only in passing, the way you notice a picture on the wall or a clock ticking. My attention was on the roast chicken cooling on the table, the sound of snow falling outside the familiar ache of being invisible. Then the spark came. Melissa shrieked, her voice slicing through the air, high and panicked. "The necklace, it's gone!" she screamed, clutching at her throat, as though the absence of it were choking her. Chairs scraped as everyone stood, eyes darting, voices rising. Diana rushed to the counter, hands shaking, searching frantically. The necklace was nowhere in sight. Melissa's eyes locked on me with a ferocity that froze my blood. She took it. She cried, pointing a finger so sharp it felt like a blade. Allison stole it. I saw her looking at it. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I shook my head violently. "No, I didn't touch it, I swear," I managed to say, but my voice was drowned beneath Melissa's hysterical sobs. "She's always jealous," Melissa wailed. "She can't stand to see me happy. She wants to ruin everything. I bet she's going to sell it just like she steals money." The words poured out of her like poison, filling the room with suspicion. Diana's face contorted with rage, her eyes blazing. She advanced toward me, her hand already raised. "You ungrateful little thief!" she shouted, and before I could back away, her palm struck my face with a force that sent me stumbling into the wall. The sting burned through my skin, tears springing to my eyes. I gasped, holding my cheek, the room spinning. "I didn't do it!" I cried, but my words were drowned by Melissa's sobs and Diana's shrieks. My father stood frozen near the table, his face pale, his mouth tight. "Dad, please," I begged, "tell them I didn't take it." But he only looked at me with disappointment, his silence louder than any accusation. "If you didn't take it, then where is it?" he asked finally, his voice low, heavy with doubt. That question gutted me more than the slap. I had no answer. No proof, nothing but my own word, and my word meant nothing in that house. Diana grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my flesh, and yanked me toward the door. "You bring shame on this family," she spat. "You're not welcome here anymore. Get out before I call the police. We won't harbor a thief." I struggled, panic rising in my chest. "Please, just search again. It has to be here." I didn't take it, but my pleas were useless. Melissa clutched her mother's shoulder, tears streaming down her face like an actress performing for an audience, and Diana nodded as though she had just witnessed a crime unfold. Richard followed us to the hall but made no move to intervene. His silence was my sentence. My feet slid across the polished floor as Diana dragged me to the front door. She flung it open, icy air rushing in, and shoved me outside. I stumbled down the steps barefoot, the snow biting into my skin, the cold searing my lungs. "Don't you dare come back until you admit what you've done!" Diana shouted, her voice carrying into the night. Melissa's sobs echoed behind her, painting me as guilty to anyone who listened. Neighbors' curtains twitched their shadows, watching as the drama unfolded. My shame was public now, my humiliation complete. I wrapped my arms around myself, my teeth chattering, the slap still throbbing on my cheek. "Dad," I whispered, turning toward the doorway, but Richard stood in the hall, his shoulders sagging, his eyes averted. He did not speak. He did not move. He let the door close, slowly shutting me out, shutting me off from the only home I had ever known. The lock clicked, final, absolute. I stood in the snow breath, turning to fog, heart hammering. I had been accused, judged, and exiled in less than 10 minutes, my fate sealed by a lie. The injustice pressed down on me so heavily I could hardly breathe. My whole body trembled not just from the cold, but from the crushing weight of betrayal. I wanted to pound on the door to scream until my voice broke to force them to see the truth. But deep down, I knew it would change nothing. In their eyes, I was guilty, and nothing I said would rewrite that. I stumbled down the driveway, snow swallowing my steps, the house glowing warmly behind me like a place I had once dreamed of belonging to but never truly did. Each step into the night felt like walking away from everything I had tried to cling to. Yet as the icy wind whipped against my face, a bitter thought took root. Maybe this was not the end, but the brutal beginning of a truth I would one day force them to face. I wandered the streets that night with snow numbing my feet and tears freezing on my cheeks, too stunned to even know where I was going. I ended up on the doorstep of my friend Katie, who had known me since middle school. When she opened the door and saw me shivering with no coat, my cheek swollen from Diana's slap, she pulled me inside without hesitation. I collapsed onto her couch, the reality crashing over me. I had no home, no family, and no defense against the accusation that had branded me a thief. Katie tried to comfort me, offering tea and blankets, but even her warmth could not thaw the chill of betrayal. For the first few weeks, I lived like a ghost crashing on Katie's sofa, sometimes scraping together enough money for a cheap motel room when I felt I was imposing too much. I picked up whatever jobs I could find waitressing during the day, cleaning offices at night, even walking dogs for neighbors. Each dollar I earned was survival a way to buy food to keep a roof, however temporary, over my head. Yet every time I closed my eyes, I saw Diana's hand striking my face. Melissa's crocodile tears, my father's silence. Those images haunted me, reminding me that I had been cast out not because of what I had done, but because of who they had always believed me to be guilty, lesser unwanted. Months passed, and with them came a grueling rhythm. I eventually landed a job at a warehouse on the edge of town, stacking boxes and working long shifts that left my muscles aching and my hands blistered. It was grueling, but it paid regularly, and for the first time since being thrown out, I could afford to rent a small room in a shared house. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a dresser, the wallpaper peeling the pipes clanking through the night, but it was mine. No one could slap me out of it. No one could accuse me of stealing within those four walls. Still, loneliness gnawed at me. Holidays were the worst. When December rolled around again, I watched families shopping for gifts, children laughing, couples embracing in the glow of Christmas lights. Each jingle of a bell stabbed me with memories of sitting at our family table of laughter that had once included me of the illusion that I had belonged. Now I was the girl who had been thrown out into the snow, the girl whose family whispered about her behind closed doors, the girl who was invisible. The injustice festered inside me, fueling both despair and determination. I could not stop replaying the night of the accusation, analyzing every second, wondering if I should have screamed louder, searched harder, fought more. But I had been powerless, and in their eyes, that was all that mattered. Slowly, I began to build something from the rubble. At the warehouse, I proved myself reliable, always arriving early, staying late, volunteering for difficult shifts. My supervisors noticed, and eventually, I was promoted to shift lead, a small but meaningful step upward. I started taking online classes in business management, using my meager savings to pay tuition. Each lecture, each assignment felt like a brick, laid in a foundation for a future that was finally mine. And yet, even as I advanced, the scars of betrayal stayed raw. Nights were filled with restless dreams of Diana's voice calling me a disgrace. Melissa's finger pointing at me like a weapon, my father's face twisted with disappointment. Waking from those dreams left me shaking, drenched in sweat, clutching my pillow as though it could anchor me to a safer world. Katie remained my anchor in reality. She reminded me that I was not alone, that family could be chosen, that my worth was not defined by lies. We would sit on her balcony drinking coffee after long days, and she would say, "One day, Allison, they'll choke on their own shame." I wanted to believe her, but shame never seemed to touch them. As far as I knew, Melissa wore that necklace proudly, Diana continued to run her household with an iron fist, and Richard continued to bury his guilt under silence. My absence was probably a relief to them. Yet there was a part of me small but unyielding that whispered of justice. I clung to it through every long night of study, every aching shift at work, every moment I felt the weight of solitude. I imagined the day the truth would surface, imagined their faces when they realized the depth of what they had done to me. Sometimes the vision kept me going, a flicker of light in the endless dark. 2 years slipped by this way. 2 years of rebuilding, of clawing my way back to dignity, of learning to trust my own strength. But the wound never healed. It remained open, festering, waiting for the one thing that could finally cleanse it, the truth. It happened on a gray morning 2 years after I had been thrown out, when I was already used to the rhythm of warehouse shifts and late-night classes, when I had nearly convinced myself the truth would never be known. My phone rang as I sat at my desk, and the caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered, my heart thumping. On the line was a police officer, his voice calm, official, the kind of voice that immediately makes you sit straighter. He asked if I was Allison and confirmed my old address, and then he said words that made my blood freeze. The missing necklace had been found. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke, but he explained that Richard and Diana had called a plumber to fix the kitchen sink. The plumber discovered the necklace lodged deep in the garbage disposal, coated in grime, damaged by the blades but unmistakably intact. The officer explained that once they examined it, they realized the necklace had likely slipped off the counter and fallen in by accident. No theft, no crime, no betrayal by me. The truth I had screamed into the night, the truth I had whispered into my pillow for years, had finally been validated. For a long moment, I could not speak, my throat closing with a mix of vindication and rage. The officer asked if I wanted to come down and collect an official statement clearing my name. My hand shook as I held the phone, the room spinning as years of humiliation collapsed into clarity. They had destroyed me for nothing. Diana had slapped me. Melissa had sobbed lies. Richard had stood silent, and all along the necklace had been lying in their sink, hidden by nothing more than carelessness. When I hung up, I sat in silence, my body trembling. Part of me wanted to laugh hysterically at the absurdity of it. Part of me wanted to scream until my voice broke. 2 years of exile, of loneliness, of clawing my way back to survival, all because they refused to believe me. Within hours, my phone lit up with messages. Richard sent a text. "We need to talk. Please call us." Diana left a voicemail, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. "Allison, it was all a mistake. We didn't know. Please come home. Let us fix this." Melissa even sent a long message full of apologies and excuses, claiming she had been emotional and scared, that she had only said what she thought was true, that she never meant for things to go so far. My chest tightened as I read their words, anger surging hot. They wanted me back now that the truth was convenient, now that their guilt was undeniable. But where had they been when I begged them to listen, when I stood barefoot in the snow, when I slept on couches and worked until my body broke? They had chosen to believe a lie. They had chosen to slap me, to exile me, to erase me. I stared at their messages, the bile rising in my throat. Vindication should have felt like victory, but instead it burned. It was too late. They had already killed the part of me that trusted them. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. I agreed to meet not for reconciliation, but for closure. I needed to see their faces when I confronted them with what they had done. I needed them to hear the weight of their betrayal in my own voice. For 2 years, they had lived under the assumption that I was guilty, and now the balance had shifted. For once, they would be forced to sit in silence as I spoke. As I prepared for that meeting, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Justice had arrived late, but undeniable. The truth had finally risen from the depths of their sink, ugly and damaged, but still enough to shatter the lies that had bound me. They had called me thief, liar, disgrace. Now the evidence stood on my side, and I would use it like a weapon. The day of the meeting, I walked out of my apartment with my head high for the first time in years. The scar of betrayal still throbbed inside me, but now I carried something stronger proof. And with proof came power, the power to confront, to demand accountability, to no longer be the silent victim of their lies. The cafe where we agreed to meet was small and quiet, tucked into the corner of a neighboring town, so we would not be seen by people who knew us, but I had no interest in keeping their shame private. I arrived early, clutching the copy of the police report the officer had given me, my hands steady though my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. I chose a table by the window where the pale winter light fell across the surface, a stage for the performance that was about to unfold. When the door opened and my father walked in with Diana at his side and Melissa trailing behind, I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching strangers. They looked older, wearier, their eyes darting nervously, their shoulders hunched as though bracing for a blow. Diana spotted me first, her mouth twitching into a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. Melissa clung to her arm, her face pale, her once bright confidence dimmed to a nervous flicker. My father hesitated before approaching, his lips pressed into a thin line. We sat across from one another, an invisible chasm between us. For a long moment, no one spoke, the air thick with unspoken words. Then Diana leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Allison, we're so sorry. We didn't know the necklace had fallen. We never should have doubted you." Her words fell like fragile glass, shattering on impact. I placed the police report on the table, sliding it toward them. "This is what I told you 2 years ago," I said, my voice sharp, cutting. "I told you I didn't steal it. I begged you to listen, and you slapped me, threw me out, left me to freeze in the snow." Melissa burst into tears, clutching at a tissue. "I thought I saw you looking at it," she sobbed. "I was upset. I panicked. I never wanted you to suffer like that." I slammed my palm against the table, the sound making them flinch. "You lied," I spat. "You pointed at me because it was easy, because you knew they would believe you over me. You ruined my life with a lie." My father finally spoke, his voice heavy with regret. "I failed you," he said, his eyes wet. "I should have stood up for you. I should have protected you." His words should have comforted me, but they only fueled my fury. "You didn't just fail me," I said coldly. "You chose to stay silent. You watched them drag me out and you let it happen. That was not failure, that was betrayal." Silence stretched across the table, the only sound Melissa's sniffles and the hum of the cafe's heater. Then I pulled out my phone and pressed play on a recording I had prepared. The officer's voice reading the official statement the necklace had been recovered from the garbage disposal. No theft had occurred. Allison was innocent. I let it play loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. Heads turned, eyes widened, whispers spread. Diana's face drained of color. Melissa's sobs grew louder, and Richard buried his face in his hands. "I wanted this to be public." I said, my voice steady, cold, merciless. "For years, you branded me a thief. You spread that story to neighbors, to relatives, to anyone who would listen. Now they will all know the truth. They will all know what you did to me." Diana reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Please, Allison, we can make this right. We can start over." I pulled back, my lip curling. "You cannot undo 2 years of exile. You cannot erase the nights I cried myself to sleep, the humiliation of being called a thief, the slap that branded me as nothing. You cannot fix this with words." Melissa wailed. "Please don't hate me. I'll do anything to make it right." I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. "Live with what you did. That's the only justice left." My father whispered, "Is there nothing we can do to regain your trust?" I shook my head slowly. "Trust is dead. You killed it when you chose silence. What you can do is face the truth of who you are and face the consequences of your lies." With that, I stood, leaving the report and the recording behind, a weapon turned back on them. As I walked out of the cafe, the eyes of strangers burned into their bowed heads, judgment falling heavier than any slap. Outside, the cold air bit into my cheeks, but for the first time in years, I felt warmth inside a fire of vindication. I had not only been proven innocent, I had exposed them for what they truly were. Their shame was now public, undeniable, and I carried that victory like armor. Leaving the cafe that day, I felt a strange lightness, as if the weight I had been carrying for years had finally shifted onto the shoulders of those who deserved it. Yet lightness was not the same as peace. The slap, the exile, the endless nights of loneliness had carved scars too deep to be erased by an apology, and I had no intention of letting those scars be dismissed as mistakes. I returned to my modest apartment, to the life I had built with blistered hands and relentless effort, and for the first time I looked at it with pride rather than shame. The peeling wallpaper, the thrift store furniture, the stack of textbooks on my desk, they were all symbols of resilience, proof that I had survived what was meant to break me. But even in that pride, I could not ignore the consequences for them. News spread quickly in our small town. People who had once whispered that I was a thief now whispered about Diana's cruelty, Melissa's lies, Richard's silence. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Co-workers cast judgmental glances, and family friends who had once praised their household now looked at them with pity or disdain. The story I had made public at the cafe had rippled outward, each retelling another blow to their carefully maintained image. Diana, once so proud of her reputation as a respectable nurse and devoted wife, found herself shunned by colleagues who had heard what she had done. Patients requested to see other nurses unwilling to be cared for by a woman who had slapped her stepdaughter and thrown her out over a lie. Melissa's engagement fell apart, her fiancé's family unwilling to attach themselves to scandal. He returned the necklace damaged and dulled from the garbage disposal and told her he could not trust someone who could destroy her own sister with false accusations. Melissa called me late one night, her voice hoarse from crying, begging me to help repair her reputation. I listened in silence, then said, "You destroyed mine first. Now you live with the same." I hung up her sobs echoing in my ears, a grim symmetry that satisfied the part of me still burning for revenge. Richard's punishment was quieter, but perhaps harsher. He lived each day under the shadow of guilt, his colleagues at the school murmuring about how a man entrusted with teaching fairness and logic could not even protect his own daughter. He tried calling me sometimes, leaving long voicemails full of apologies, sometimes short messages just saying he missed me, but I ignored most of them. When I did listen, all I heard was a man drowning in his own regret, too late, too broken to be of use to me. I had begged him to defend me when it mattered, and he had chosen silence. That was the choice that defined him, and nothing he said now could undo it. For me, consequences came in the form of choices. I had the choice to let them back into my life, to soften, to forgive, or I had the choice to guard the boundaries I had carved out of blood and frost. I chose the latter. I continued my classes, pouring my energy into building a future that was mine alone. The warehouse promoted me again this time into a management role, and for the first time in my life, I had a salary that allowed me to move into a larger apartment, one with bright windows and a balcony where I could sit and breathe freely. I filled it with plants and books with little reminders that this space was mine, untainted by their judgment. Therapy became part of my routine. I found a counselor who specialized in family trauma, and together we untangled the knots of anger and grief that had bound me for so long. She taught me that forgiveness was not about excusing them, but about freeing myself from carrying their poison. I practiced setting boundaries, practiced saying no, practiced releasing the need for their approval. Slowly, painfully, I began to let go of the constant replay of the slap, the accusation, the door slamming. The memories remained, but they no longer dictated my every breath. Still, I wanted them to feel the full weight of what they had done. So when relatives invited me to holiday gatherings, I declined, knowing my absence would sting. When people asked why I was not with my family, I told the truth plainly. They threw me out because of a lie, and I will not sit at their table again. The honesty shocked people, and in their shock came more whispers, more shame directed at Diana and Richard and Melissa. It was not revenge in the violent sense, but a steady, relentless exposure, a reminder that their actions had permanent consequences. There were nights when loneliness crept back in, when I longed for the simple comfort of a family dinner, of belonging without question. But then I remembered the sting of that slap, the cold of the snow under my bare feet, the silence of my father, and the longing turned to steel. I had lost a family but gained myself, and that was a trade I would not reverse. As the years turned, I achieved milestones they never expected me to reach. I graduated with a degree in business management, accepted a position at a logistics firm in a larger city, and moved into a home that truly felt like mine. Each success was a quiet defiance, a way of proving that their betrayal had not destroyed me, but propelled me forward. And each success was something they had to watch from afar, excluded, powerless, left to stew in their own regret. One summer afternoon, years later, I returned briefly to my old town for a visit with Katie. We walked past the house where I had grown up, the house that had once been my prison and my battlefield. The windows were shuttered, the paint peeling the garden overgrown. It looked smaller, weaker, no longer the fortress that had held me captive. I stood at the gate for a long moment, the memories washing over me, then turned away. That house was no longer mine. My home was wherever I built it, wherever truth and resilience replaced lies and violence. The slap had once defined me, but now it was only the beginning of a story that ended with strength. Diana lost her job after too many complaints. Melissa moved away in disgrace. Richard retired early, weighed down by guilt. Their lives crumbled under the pressure of the truth they had once refused to face. That was their consequence. Mine was freedom.